sponsored by the America-Israel Friendship League. I'm an evangelical Christian, longtime supporter of Israel, and the AIFL is a terrific group based in New York that exists solely to build relationships and cultivate friendships for Israel. And so we are putting together this seminar group. I have one quick announcement. Unfortunately, Dr. Alex Grobman was supposed to be with us and has fallen ill at the last moment, unfortunately, but we look forward to having him with us the next time. So you'll have me today and also Ambassador Uri Barner later this morning. So again, I appreciate very much you being here, and the viewing audience we also welcome. This is a program very dear to my heart. Advocating for Israel for the past 20 years has been a big part of my life, and so we're excited about this today. I also want to thank Pastor Chris Quintana here at Calvary Chapel, Cyprus, for allowing us to be here. I mentioned last night at the Wednesday night service that if you are a Christian in a church today in America and your pastor is biblical, you are blessed indeed. And I know that Calvary Cyprus is abundantly blessed in that area. And so again, we appreciate the friendly environment that we can do this in. Well, I want to start this morning's session to try and answer the question, why Israel? A lot of people would answer that in different ways. It means different things to different people. I think there are even conversations now, especially among Christians, about what it means to support Israel. I know what it means to me, and some of our ideological opponents on the other side, those that advocate for the Palestinians, and I'm talking primarily of those in the church today, have their narrative. I have my narrative. And so today I want to try and speak a bit from the heart and attempt to answer this question of why supporting Israel is an important issue. In our world today, in our society, there are obviously a lot of things going on. A lot of things compete for our time, and people have many, many distractions and many stressors. Everything from families trying to raise children to businesses trying to stay afloat. And so there are a lot of things that compete for our time. But as Christians, I think we understand that the issue of Israel is important. And so I want to talk a bit about that today. We'll kind of do a combination of what I call a heart talk, which involves why it matters to us internally, and also we'll talk about some facts and data and things like that that will help you as you advocate for Israel. I assume that most of the people here today and watching are interested in the subject, and so we'll try to go through this together. This is a group with the America-Israel Friendship League. As I mentioned, they work tirelessly to foster understanding, and they do a lot of different things ranging from seminars like this to taking delegation tours to Israel, including Christian groups. This is a group of vets, and they go for a week or 10 days, and as you can imagine, come back changed for the better. And they really are able to see Israel as she really is. Okay? We're all aware of media and the way media portrays the Jewish state. Before I went the first time, I was a little apprehensive. We all hear about the violence and that sort of thing. I felt safer in Israel than I do walking across the street to get my mail every day with the way people drive in my neighborhood. The Israelis are very good at security. They're very good at a lot of things. It's a wonderful country. I would highly, highly recommend it. In fact, I would urge you to visit if you're able to at all. You will feel quite safe. You'll see a lot of amazing things, and groups like the AIFL contribute to that greatly. I told you that I wanted to speak a bit from the heart today. I am a big believer that in advocating for Israel, if we rely only on data and facts, we're going to lose a lot of people that might otherwise be interested. I personally don't think that you can divorce the heart connection from Israel advocacy. And so I want to talk to you today, this morning, about a few of my impressions that I've had visiting Israel and some of the friends that I have. And by the way, there are also depictions of Israelis in the press that are often inaccurate. To paraphrase a great fellow from my home state, Will Rogers, I've never met an Israeli I didn't like. They are wonderful people. The Jewish people are a noble people. They are accomplished. They have done many great things for the world. They have a lot of virtues that people often don't hear about. Now, for our purposes here today, as I said, I think it's important to link the past with the present and the future. And so, this image I took from the balcony of my hotel a couple of years ago. It's a Jerusalem suburb, West Jerusalem. It was early in the morning, as you can tell. It was at dawn, and I was looking out across, and I saw this cluster of homes on the hillside. Now, you could go anywhere else in the world and see homes, subdivisions, nothing to distinguish them. Everybody lives somewhere. But the fact that there are millions of Jews living in Israel today is an astonishing miracle. Given the things that the Jewish people have had to endure over the years, the Holocaust, the pogroms, the harassment, the fact that they're back in the land today and thriving is really huge. And so I love to look at scenes like this. I call them miracles of the mundane. Again, you're seeing things that would be ordinary anywhere else. To see Jews living in Israel today and thriving is a wonderful, wonderful scene. And it calls to mind a quote I've heard. As a writer, it delights me to no end that certain novelists seem to understand the Jewish people and the significance of Israel. They certainly understand it better than many Christian leaders today in this country. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, the somewhat of an erosion of support for Israel among American Christian leadership. But I've been struck by the fact over the years that two or three novelists I admire really got Israel. One of them was Walker Percy. And Percy once asked a famous question. It's one of my favorite statements of all time. He said that when he visits New York City and he walks down the street, he never sees a Hittite, but he sees Jews. You understand? The Hittites, the great ancient civilization, is gone. They are gone from history, never to rise again. But the Jewish people came back from 2,000 years of exile, and they're back in the land exactly as the prophets foretold. And so the question is a little humorous, but I think it's more sublime. Where are all the Hittites in New York City? They don't exist, but the Jews exist. And we're all the better for it. And it's also a huge nod to the sovereignty of the Lord, who promised that He would preserve them. He promised that He would bring them back against all odds. And so He did. There is in the church today a question that bothers, that rankles too many people, and that is the question of the chosen people. Many times over the years I have talked to Christians who are bothered by the status of the Jewish people as, quote, God's chosen people. There seems to be a jealousy in the church, which I find very unfortunate. But the fact is that the Jews did not choose the distinction for themselves. It was given to them. Several times in Scripture, the Lord makes it very clear that He chose them. He told them that He chose them because He loved their fathers. He chose them because He had a plan that is unfolding to this day. And so the Jews did not choose to be chosen. They simply have to live with it. And it's caused them too many times, too many problems from people who should be their friends. There are a lot of misconceptions about Israel. We're going to get into some of those later. A lot of misconceptions about the Jewish people themselves. As I told you, I have found the Jewish people to be wonderful, to be noble. I am continually blessed that God simply put a love for the Jewish people in my heart. That's the whole thing. To advocate for them in other ways is just icing on the cake for me. But they are quite different as a people than many have heard, and I hope to impart some of that to you today. One of the reasons why Israel, perhaps the chief reason, is because Israel is on God's mind. I took this photo at Jaffa Gate a few years ago after a rainstorm, and I was reminded as I stood there and looked up those walls of the old city that the Lord said in Isaiah 49, "I have engraved you on the palms of my hands, and your walls are ever before me." He wasn't talking about the church. Scripture is always clear. Where the Lord is talking about the Jewish people in Israel, He says so explicitly. Just as He says in Ezekiel 37, this is the house of Israel. Ezekiel 37, the dry bones chapter, and this is just a quick aside, is not about resurrecting a dead, lifeless church. It's about the resurrection of the Jewish people to life, to national life, at a certain point in the future. And I think we clearly see that unfolding now. So, the Lord Himself is much concerned about Israel and the Jewish people. There's no question about that. And so it seems to me that as believers who are following our own faith, that we should come alongside them in friendship, partnership, and help them in any way that we can. And that is an issue that I often run into as well. Individuals will say, well, I don't know what I can do for Israel. How can I support Israel? I'm just one person. There are a lot of things you can do. Not everyone has to go out and write a book, and not everybody has to head a major ministry or a major pros or organization. You as an individual can advocate for Israel wherever you are. I would encourage you to educate yourselves. I would encourage you to avail yourselves of information through groups like the AIFL. You can go to AIFL.org and check out their work. There are groups like CAMRA, the media watchdog group that has a lot of great information, Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel. Wherever you are, you can be a strong and effective advocate for Israel, especially today when they face challenges that are unprecedented. The Jewish state is facing challenges today that I would argue are greater than any in their modern history, and that's 67 years. And they have certainly been in peril before. But there are challenges to their sovereignty. There are existential challenges, and we're aware of those. But that makes it all the more important for you to choose to advocate for Israel, and there are myriad ways to do that. One of the things that strikes me about Israel is, in terms of uniqueness, is the unrelenting wars that have been launched against them from the beginning. It's disconcerting to see them continually surrounded by neighbors who wish them harm. There are facts of history that I think bear mentioning. When Israel was established in 1948, the following day, on a promise, 5 neighboring armies invaded. And they went to war right from the start. Because, you see, their neighbors would not accept the presence of a Jewish state in their midst. And many of them are still in a constant state of war against the Jews. This is a picture, a photo that I love of Jonathan Netanyahu. This is during the Yom Kippur War. This is immediately after a battle with Syrian troops in the north. You probably recognize the name. Jonathan, or Yonatan, as he was known, was a legendary fighter in the Israel Defense Forces. And there are critics today, among them pacifists, among them critics of Israel, that claim that they are expansionists, they are warlike themselves. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Jonathan Netanyahu was among the greatest of Jewish fighters in history. He was also a man of letters. He was a very introspective man. He would periodically go back to college. He attended Harvard. But always the pull of the land and the people brought him back. And so he found himself leading an elite commando unit in Israel's Sariyat Matkal, their elite special forces. Now, his father, the current prime minister's father as well, there are 3 sons. Professor Benzion Netanyahu died a couple of years ago at the age of 102. And I had the privilege of knowing him the last decade of his life. And when I would go to Jerusalem, I would go and visit with him in his home. To sit and listen to him, a renowned historian, was fascinating in itself, but to see the man as he really was even more a thrill. You know, his critics would accuse him of several things, being a strident nationalist, xenophobic even, that he hated the Arabs and that sort of thing. I found him to be a pretty swell guy. As I said, fascinating to listen to, but to listen to him in his living room in the evenings talk about the ideals of Zionism was a real treat. And to listen to the clock tick in the living room, and then to look across into the family dining room and look at a bronze bust of Yoni. It would definitely change the way you think about the Jewish people. If you think that they're harsh and warlike, to get to know them is a different reality. And so in that setting, I was aware of the sacrifices that the Jews have made to establish themselves in their homeland and maintain what they have. It is the Jewish state, of course, home to about 7 million people now. The first waves of Jewish immigration began in earnest in the late 19th century. And by the time that statehood came into existence, they had several 100,000 people living there. All of the things that they've accomplished, all of the technology, all of the benefits to mankind. You know, when there's a natural disaster, the Israelis are the first with boots on the ground, wherever it is. Setting up mobile field hospitals, bringing experts. But all of these things they accomplish in the face of constant warlike conditions. And so I want to run through just a few examples of their modern military miracles and let you draw your own conclusions as to how they've survived. In 1967, after 19 years of statehood, the Israelis had a barely defensible border system. A very narrow country. It still is, but then it was more so. Added to the problem was the fact that dictators like Egypt's General Nasser were saber-rattling. And Nasser decided that he would be the latest dictator in the Middle East who would claim that he would wipe Israel off the map. And so he decided to mass his troops on the border with Sinai and threaten the Jews. The Jews are the only country in the world that face existential threat every day. We don't. Canada doesn't. Belgium doesn't. South Africa doesn't. Only Israel. And they have accomplished tremendous things in the face of this constant state of war. So in '67, they were aware that war was coming. And so they prepared continually, as they do today, for the next round of hostilities. Now, a more innovative people you'll be hard-pressed to find. And so the Israelis decided that they had to strike first. If they waited for the Egyptians and the Syrians and the others to attack first, they might be overrun. So there was a fellow named Ezra Weitzman who was head of the Air Force. Now, by this time, he had semi-retired, but for 10 years, since this '56 Sinai campaign, he had worked on a tactic, a battle tactic. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to reduce the turnaround time for Israeli pilots flying a bombing mission, a sortie. You know, to come back to base, to land, to refuel, to rearm, get the pilot back in the air. You know, the Egyptians weren't dumb. They were doing the same thing. They were continually refining the hardware and the expertise that the Soviets were providing for them. So they were also working on this component, and what it was, again, was to reduce the turnaround time for pilots. Egypt actually shaved the time for their pilots to several hours so that they would be back in the air and ready to be effective again. Do you know what Israel reduced their turnaround time to? 8 minutes. 8 minutes. For all their innovation and daring and personal courage, I would suggest to you that there's other forces at work. Ariel Sharon, in his biography, Warrior, said at one point, there's something that keeps this nation. And so it is. The Israeli Air Force that morning went up. They turned toward the Mediterranean to the west as if they were on maneuvers. The Egyptians had been watching them do this for weeks. All of a sudden, they turned sharply back toward the east. And within a couple of minutes, the Egyptian Air Force was exposed to them on the ground. They knocked out half of Egypt's Air Force in 30 minutes. How do they do that? The rest of the week was one astonishing miracle after another, and at the end of the week, the 6-day war, they had retaken their ancestral homeland, the heart of the country, the biblical homeland, the mountains of Israel, what the world calls the West Bank. How did they do that? In 1973, they were a little bit lulled to sleep. You know, when you win a war in that fashion, with that impressive of a victory, you know, you sometimes can go to sleep at the switch a bit. And they were caught off guard in the fall of '73, the eve of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur meaning, in the Hebrew, Day of Atonement. It's the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. So everybody was at home, secular and religious. And on Yom Kippur, everything comes to a standstill in the country. And that's the moment that Egypt and Syria decided to attack. a surprise attack. Now, the Israelis were so knocked off their feet in the first 24 hours that there was concern that a nuclear confrontation would happen in the Middle East. Israel has never actually admitted to a nuclear program, but they do have nuclear facilities in the south part of the country. They have always said officially Israel won't be the first country to use nukes in the Middle East. So their situation was beyond precarious. Moshe Dayan went to the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, and he said, "Mrs. Prime Minister, the Third Commonwealth is in danger," meaning the third period of Jewish sovereignty in the land is in danger. And so this was much more than a high-stakes war. War in the Middle East doesn't last very long if Israel's involved because the country's so small. You're not going to have a long, protracted conventional war of several years like World War II. It's going to be over in a matter of weeks. So Israel slowly fought back, and Ariel Sharon, who had retired earlier in the spring, the Major General, command of a tank division, he was back on his farm. So when the fighting broke out, he went to the front like everyone else, took command of his old group, and he would get on the radio and radio back to Central Command that he had a plan. And, they were like, "Hey, we've got things going on. You just do what we tell you and, stop bothering us." Well, finally somebody listened to him, and his plan was quite daring. He wanted to build a pontoon bridge across the Suez Canal at night. And finally they gave him the green light to do that. So one morning, at about mid-morning, when the fog and mist had burned off, Egypt's Third Army found themselves surrounded by Sharon. The war was over. Then the international community jumped in to hammer together a ceasefire. So long as the Jews are being assaulted and on the run, there's no ceasefire talk. As soon as the Egyptians saw that Sharon was an hour from Cairo, and the Syrians saw that they were an hour from Damascus, there was a ceasefire. Built a pontoon bridge across the Suez in the middle of the night, poured tanks and men across it, surrounded Egypt's Third Army. How did they do that? Why Israel? What makes Israel special? 1976, just 3 years later, and a lot of you here in attendance will remember, as I do, that in the 70s and early 80s, airline hijackings were pretty popular. It's what terrorists like to do in order to advance whatever cause they wanted. They would make demands after capturing an airplane. And so we were preparing for our bicentennial that summer, as many of you also remember. And about a week before, a plane, a French airliner, was on its way from Tel Aviv to Paris. And they stopped in Athens to refuel. And as soon as they got back in the air, a small group of German and PLO terrorists stood up and took control of the plane. Now they did an odd thing. They flew very far. Most of the time they would either stay at the airport or fly a short distance and then make their demands known. But this time they flew south, and they refueled in Libya again and then flew on to an African country called Uganda. Some of you will remember this event as well. They landed at a remote airport at the town of Entebbe. The Israelis made it a practice never to negotiate with terrorists, okay, for obvious reasons. If the terrorists know what you're going to do and they sense weakness, at the very least, they're going to up their demands the next time. You can't feed that monster and satisfy him. The problem this time was the unique circumstances. There was not an opportunity for the IDF to rescue these people, as there had been in the past. They had successfully freed hostages before, including an operation led by Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, who would both go on to become prime minister. This time, though, 2,500 miles from home, I mean, what are you going to do? There's not much to do. And so the terrorists wanted the release of, I think, 58 other terrorists held in prisons in Israel and in Europe. And if they didn't get it, they were going to kill the hostages. And even more chillingly, they had separated the Jewish passengers from everyone else and let everyone else go home. Some of the Jewish passengers on the plane were Holocaust survivors. Can you imagine? 35 years later, you're being selected again by the Germans. So people in Israel, obviously, were at the point of being hysterical. And they were lobbying the government to do anything to bring their families home. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister. He was under, obviously, tremendous pressure. In Israel, the country is very small, and everybody sort of knows each other. So, the families were going to the Knesset and demanding, they were picketing while the ministers were going in and out of the building. Tremendous pressure. So an Israeli Air Force officer got an idea, and he went to some of his superiors and he said, I think there's an opportunity here to do an operation. Obviously, nobody expected anything like that. So, after Defense Minister Shimon Peres listened, he agreed that if they could come up with a coherent plan, he would consider taking it to the cabinet for approval. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. So, Rabin and the cabinet announced publicly that they would negotiate with the terrorists. And that was a key moment, because the terrorists relaxed and they extended the deadline to Sunday morning, July 4th. And they gave the Israelis just enough time. So they put together an assault team. They actually sent 200 of their best commandos in 4 transport planes. But the tip of the spear was the Syriat Matkal, the elite counterterrorism unit commanded by Jonathan Netanyahu. Now, I could give a whole talk just on the operation, but basically this is what happened. They practiced for a little more than 24 hours. Peres was satisfied that the plan was at least plausible, so he went to the cabinet, and the cabinet was still considering the operation when the force left. They got in planes at the southern tip of the Sinai. They had to fly all night. They had to fly 8 hours in the dark. They were going to go in and hope to gain the element of surprise and assume that the Ugandans would think at the airport that they were simply a commercial airliner, which is exactly what happened. They were in the air before they got the green light from the cabinet to proceed with the operation. When they got to Entebbe, the first plane landed, the first plane with Syriat Matkal. They were offloading vehicles and men while the plane was taxiing the other way. They drove a mile to the terminal building where they knew the hostages were being held. They burst in the doors. They eliminated all the terrorists in 90 seconds. In 5 minutes, the whole operation was over, and they were putting people on planes to take them back to Israel. 10 years ago, I had the privilege of talking to 2 of the commandos that went to Entebbe, including Surian Hershko, who was a member of the Golani Brigade. He was shot in the neck during the operation and has been a quadriplegic ever since. I visited him in his home in Tel Aviv, and the point of this is to give you a different picture of an Israeli Jew, and what they're about. They're about life. The Jews love life. Their enemies love death. And I was talking to Serene, and I said, "What were you thinking on the flight?" He said, "Well, we were obviously thinking different things." And I said, "Did you secretly wish that the plane would just turn around and go back to Israel?" And he looked me in the eye and he said, "I wanted to go. And I would do it again." I talked to the fellow who was a 21-year-old sergeant at the time. He was due to be mustered out of the Army in a week. And by the way, this was all volunteer force. Can you imagine? You're going to go invade a country in the middle of Africa in the middle of the night? They had no idea what the outcome would be, really. They thought they might have to cut their way through the jungle with machetes to get to Kenya if the whole thing went bad. These guys have volunteered because they said the people were in danger. So this next fellow that I talked with, his task given to him by Jonathan Netanyahu was to be the first one in the door. And he said, 100 things had to happen right that night, but the number one thing was the element of surprise. Because if they had known what we were doing, they would simply have turned around and killed all the hostages. He said, "Jim, did you know that the terrorists and the Ugandan soldiers helping them guard the hostages did not know what was happening until I was in the doorway?" He went in first. Another guy went in behind him, turned to the right and the left, at the same time yelling with a megaphone for the hostages to stay down and firing their weapons at the terrorists. Probably still the greatest rescue operation of all time. How do you think they did that? Why Israel? What sets the Jews apart? The last example is a few years after this, 1981, again in the summer, again another threat from a dictator in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein this time was building a nuclear reactor in the Iraqi desert, about 500 miles due east of Israel, Jerusalem. And he was building a super gun, and he was literally going to, as he said, as Nasser had said, as Haman said, as all the despots of the past, Hitler said, they were going to wipe out the Jews. So the head of the Mossad went to Menachem Begin one day and he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, our intelligence tells us that within a few weeks it'll be past the point of no return." So Begin had obviously a difficult decision to make. He decided to send an Air Force strike force against the reactor at Osirak. They were going to send 8 F-16s, each mounted with 2 2,000-pound bombs. Now, the colonel in charge of the operation, he was told that they would go in the evening at night so that the Iraqis obviously couldn't see them. And he said, no. That's no good. That doesn't work, because if we can't see the target, then it's all for nothing. Okay? And they understood the existential threat that their people were under. And they went enthusiastically. The Israelis calculated how many planes they would lose, how many crewmen. They hoped some could ditch in the Jordanian desert. They topped their fuel tanks off because it was such a great distance to fly. And when they would empty one tank, they would jettison it so they'd lighten their load. The colonel in charge of the operation said, "We need to go in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in broad daylight." When When they reached the target, 14 of the 16 bombs were a direct hit. You know, Syric, the nuclear facility to this day, is still a jumbled mass of metal and concrete. When they flew home, they didn't lose a plane, they didn't lose a man, not a scratch on them. And when they flew back to the west, obviously they're coming home at sunset. And this lead pilot looked at the horizon. And a thought came to him. And he radioed back to every crew. And they said in unison what Joshua had said so long before. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ailon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the people had avenged themselves on their enemies. Why Israel? What do you think is going on? How do people pull off miracle after miracle on that scale? You know as well as I do. And it is the thing that separates them from everyone else. Their love for life, their ideals, and the one who fights for them. This commitment to life, this passion to preserve life, to protect the innocent, to rescue the imperiled, is something about Israel that constantly is on my mind. A few summers ago, I was visiting north of Tel Aviv, the Meir Amit Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center. Really a fascinating place, the beginnings of the Israeli intelligence community. And they have displays inside and films you can watch and things. But before I went in, I was kind of milling around outside. And they have a series of reliefs, these huge blocks of stone outside in a courtyard in a plaza area. And I'm just walking along, and I don't speak or read Hebrew. And so I'm seeing the Hebrew characters, and I really don't know what's going on. You know, I knew it was something significant. But I started noticing this date, 6/10/73, meaning 10th month, October 6, 1973. Name after name of Israeli intelligence officers who were stationed in neighboring Arab enemy countries providing life-saving intelligence for their nation. And their names are inscribed, many of them, October 6, 1973, because when the war started and they had been passing information on to the people back home to defend the country, they were captured by those countries they were in and were killed. Now, the commitment to defending your country isn't unique to Israel, but I would suggest to you, I would argue, that their commitment to it is elevated above what it is to other people. Again, constantly under existential threat. By the way, I like to make this point in front of Christian audiences, and especially those who are supportive of Israel. There is a climate of fear today due to the Iranian threats to wipe Israel off the map, right? We've been hearing about it for several years. At this moment, in the summer of 2015, we don't yet know the outcome, but it is a high-stakes situation. The Iranians evidently are close to having nuclear capability. Their president has openly said they want to destroy Israel. We all know that story. I have a different take on the outcome, however, as a pro-Israel Christian who believes the Bible. Okay? I believe Scripture is true. And if it is, and I recognize this is pie-in-the-sky weirdness to a lot of people, but it isn't to me. The fact is that it's not Israel that's in trouble. It's everyone else. Iran is in a great deal of trouble. Do you remember what we just talked about? Dictator after dictator that threatened to wipe them off the map. They're all gone. They're all gone. And so too will the Iranian overlords who threaten not only their own people but the Israelis. Israel isn't going anywhere. And I think even this is a key component for us, and I'm talking to my own people here. Community of believers who want to advocate for Israel, part of advocacy is your spiritual strength. Your inner spiritual strength that is for Israel, is for the Jewish people. Another reason that I believe Israel is worth advocating for at the very least, worth defending. They're the tip of the spear in the Middle East, at least, for the rest of us. 73 Yom Kippur War here, Moshe Dayan with Sharon. After victory, can you imagine what would have happened if they lost? And here, I'm going to be selfish for once when it comes to Israel. I'm not talking about what would have happened to Israel. That's obvious. That operation by Syria and Egypt was a pincer movement. They were going to link up in Tel Aviv and destroy the country. That's what was going to happen to Israel. But we're all self-centered, so what would have happened to us? Can you imagine energy prices if Israel was not there to defend our interests as well? It may not be their primary focus, but they are protecting our interests as well in many ways, including the intelligence gathering aspect. But can you imagine buying oil from triumphant Arab countries that no longer had the threat of Israel on their doorstep? I mean, we'd all be driving Fred Flintstone cars, right? Israel has our back. We should have theirs. Why Israel? Israel, as I've said before, is a miracle. 3-4 years ago, I had the privilege of taking my 19-year-old son with me to Israel, just to see it. No business. So we blocked out plenty of time. I knew that he was getting ready to get into his life, you know. We may not have the chance again. So we went. I wanted him to see the place for himself. And one night, we were having dinner in a great little restaurant just inside Jaffa Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. The thing had been a part of a Crusaders' fortress 1,000 years ago. You got all this history around you, and it's all very interesting, of course. But after dinner, I said, well, let's take a walk around the old city and we'll see some things. And so we walked into the Jewish quarter. Now, another thing that I admire about the Israelis is their their technical know-how, but also their culture and just their society in general. They strive for quality in everything they do. So when you walk through the Jewish quarter in the Old City, it's very impressive. Everything is clean. Everything is well maintained. So we're walking along, and we passed this archaeological excavation, these columns from the Roman period. And specifically, this was an area where the Romans sacked Jerusalem in AD 70 and destroyed the temple. So there it is. I mean, you're just walking down a modern street, and all of a sudden you look over, and there's an ancient street with these columns. So there's the ancient part, the beginning of the long exile of the Jewish people, the 2,000-year exile, when the Romans expelled them from the land. But Jonathan and I are walking along, and we looked up, and there's these apartments, the light on inside, the windows open. You could hear dishes clattering, people talking, families, music being played. I said, "Do you hear that? Do you know the significance of that?" They were dead, and now they're alive again. All because the Lord said they would be. Because He said He would preserve them. Astonishing. It's an astonishing feeling to walk through that place, that symbol of death and destruction and shame. And then in the same place, joy, unspeakable, triumph, a look to the future. Why Israel? At the same time, I was walking in another archaeological park in the Old City. I was walking along, and there was this ancient stone arch. You walk past it, and you're almost in it. And I looked up, same kind of thing. Look at that. They were gone. They were expelled from their ancestral land. And guess what flag flies over Jerusalem today? The Israeli Star David. Look at that. Do you understand the significance of the miracle of Israel? That their experience and their existence now is unprecedented in history? That they have the tenacity to love life while their enemies hate life and love death? They've come back after all this time. Why do you think they've come back? Why Israel? There are a lot of answers to that question, and some of them are adequate. Some of them are good and plausible. But as Christians who advocate for Israel, if you want to reach the next generation, you cannot deal only in facts and data. You're going to lose the next generation, the millennials. You must help answer the question for them, why Israel? Israel is a miracle because the Lord said they would be. Period. He said, when they come to the moment of their greatest peril in the future, I will fight for them as I did in the days of old. And so He is, and so He will. The question of why Israel means a lot of things to a lot of people. For me, it's the reasons I've outlined. The reason that I have my marching orders. to advocate for a noble people. A people maligned all through their history, maligned to this very moment. We live in a time where there's a real inversion of the truth. As the prophet Isaiah said, good will be evil and evil will be good. We live in that time. But the Lord's provision for His people that He chose, that He alone chose, is permanent and irrevocable. And that's good enough for me. Thank you very much. That will conclude the first session. We will take a break, and in about 20 minutes we'll be back and hopefully hear from Ambassador Uri Barner, live from Israel. He's going to visit with us via Skype. He has a great record in the diplomatic corps for Israel for a long time. He's now currently the senior advisor to the chairman of the America-Israel Friendship League. And Uri is a terrific guy, has a lot of knowledge in particular about his time as ambassador to Turkey. And so we'll take a break, and we're going to hopefully get him on Skype and be back at about 10:30.